Kia ora koutou, everyone. Welcome to this presentation that Julia and I are going to jointly present, so there'll be a bit of tag teaming here. Let's make sure you guys can all see my screen all right, and
yep.
And move this thing out of the way maybe. So the idea today is to give people a fairly high level overview of what we're doing in the thriving residential communities area, and talk about why we're doing work in this area, and what our focuses are on. So this is when we talk about this topic, we sort of look at international lessons, and Mary Comerio in 2019 at the QuakeCoRE annual meeting, she came and talked about her lessons from an international perspective, and the importance of residential communities, noting that housing, of course, is 80% plus often of the building stock. And when we have urban disasters, these are really these housing disasters. And if we want to make sure that our communities are really staying in place, then we need to limit the impact of the earthquake shaking on our housing. And she indicated some figures there: 10 to 20% of housing, if it becomes uninhabitable, that can essentially drive people out of a community. And then she also mentions that lower income groups have a harder time with repairs and recovery, and I believe there's some evidence to suggest that that's also been seen in the Canterbury earthquakes too. So that was in terms of recovery. And then she also talked about resilience and what it means how do we achieve resilience in our residential communities. And she talked about the need for inventories, both physical and demographic, and better research into planning and recovery. So she was already talking about better insurance options, streamline processes, support people and processes, targeted programs for vulnerable populations. And I think quite a few things when she was saying this were resonating with people in New Zealand. We have a very strong insurance market here. Most of our housing, I think all our housing, is covered by the EQC insurance, and then we get additional insurance, but we have a really big insurance system. And though, is there a better way that things could have proceeded with insurance? And then she was talking about the need for low damage construction technologies, the need for regulatory change. So how are our planning and land use affecting things, and how could that improve things? And need for a national planning which is adaptable locally. I'll hide this thing, it's not really happening. Okay, then we looked at the lessons from Canterbury earthquakes, and I'll hand over to Julia for this part. Julia, are you unmuted?
I've just unmuted myself. I'll just get you to click through on the lessons from the Canterbury earthquakes. Yeah, so essentially, I mean, we know that the Canterbury earthquake is well known nationally and internationally that it was a really massive event, and that there were large numbers of people killed, mainly in the CBD, from two large building collapses. But also we saw in the residential sector that there were many houses that were affected. They were damaged. There were approximately 10,000 houses that needed demolishing, and over 100,000 damaged, and a lot of issues around people being able to either continue to live there or needing to find rental properties and move out of some of those houses. And some of this has been quite ongoing. Obviously, issues related to residential areas weren't just around the houses themselves, but they were also infrastructure formed part of that. So there were power cuts sort of in the immediate response kind of recovery period after the earthquakes. And there was a lot of damage to infrastructure, such as roads, making it hard for people to go about their daily lives, to even kind of get in and out of work. There was extensive and repeated liquefaction, resulting in the red zone, the rezoning of some residential areas in the CBD, and people having to move out of that area. And then other infrastructural problems around things like sewage systems, and some of these repairs are still ongoing over the long term. I'll just get you to click through to the next slide, Tim. And so there were numerous health, psychosocial issues and distress that resulted from this residential disruption, both from the immediate aftermath of the event itself and having ongoing aftershocks was not very pleasant, and the nature of the residential recovery process. I'm just going to get you to click through all of those because I've got another slide which I'll show you. So if you click onto the next one. And so Ken, in his talk at the New Zealand Society for Earthquake Engineering Conference, I think it was 2 weeks ago, he put together a nice slide based on the Canterbury Wellbeing Survey, which really highlighted that a lot of the issues around distress for people related to building and housing damage, which he said in his speech was probably not that surprising when you look at it. But the red in this particular diagram on this graph over time really highlights that some of the building issues that had an impact on people's well-being. So yeah, definitely worth a look if you haven't seen his talk already. So if you click through to the next slide, Tim. So yeah, again, so the lessons from the Canterbury earthquakes, the psychosocial health issues, widespread housing damage, which is obviously costly, time-consuming to repair, and the insurance process is really still ongoing 10 years after the earthquakes, with some claims still not resolved. Huge number of losses, and many of these were due to the residential sector. And you see this in other earthquakes as well around the world. So for example, in the Northridge earthquake, a lot of damage and losses due to impacts on the residential sector. So I'll hand back over to Tim now to keep on going.
Yeah, sure. So Julia, maybe if you could mute yourself, sorry, because I'm just getting an echo as I talk. So in terms of engineering, it's a good point for Julia to hand over because I start talking about limit states. So in engineering, we talk about an ultimate limit state design versus serviceability limit state design. So what we could see from housing performance in New Zealand is that our houses are really quite life safe. Like, it's very difficult for them to cause an issue if we're talking about modern houses. Some of our older houses with big brick chimneys and maybe on slopes could be more of a life safety issue, but generally our houses perform well from a life safety point of view. And yet we notice that the damage and disruption associated with trying to claim and repair your buildings is that performance is not good. And so we could say our serviceability, or let's say our low damage design criteria and targets are needed. We also recently had a seminar as part of IP2, this theme, by EQC and Tonkin and Taylor. And this is one of the figures they showed, which is where they're going and learning from all the claims and shaking. And we're getting information on essentially what was the cause of damage and loss. And it's well recognized that liquefaction was a major problem in the Canterbury earthquakes, and it attributed to around about, I've heard around 50% of the total claims. So of that $16 billion of losses, around half of that was liquefaction-induced damage, or ground, not just liquefaction, but also ground movement, let's say. And half of it was therefore not. And if you notice, the damage ratio for buildings that were not really affected by liquefaction is much lower, but of course the frequency of those types of damage is very high. So we're seeing widespread damage, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a bit later. So what we're aiming to do in this project is really work on performance, thinking about all those areas. There's already been quite a lot done by the community in terms of trying to improve liquefaction. Arguably more could be done, but we'll also talk about how we can try and work on the areas that are not liquefying. How do we reduce damage there? I also noticed that this figure's distinguishing between sites on sloping lands versus flat sites. And there's generally, this perception that buildings on our slopes are not performing as well as buildings on flat land. So there are changes to design provisions needed for that as well. So that sort of background has led to this proposal and the forming of this research community or group, looking at thriving residential communities. And Julia and I are helping to lead that. And how does it fit into QuakeCoRE 2 structure? You see we have, of course, a series of disciplinary type projects in red boxes there on the left. And we have these interdisciplinary projects, which include the first one on functional recovery with building repairable buildings. And then there's ours on thriving residential communities. Now, there was some discussion around whether shouldn't our work fit into that functional recovery, but actually we felt there was quite a significant difference there, that people were able to function in their houses after an earthquake, but still the damage and the repair process meant that they were not really that happy with the overall performance. So we're sort of focusing on a different type of performance target. And I won't go into the other areas highlighted there, but just you can see it's a broad, big structure for QuakeCoRE 2. So what are our housing objectives in QuakeCoRE 2? The overall objectives are to identify engineering and technological solutions to effectively reduce damage and losses. We want to work towards improved insurance processes and frameworks, effective legislation and planning. I guess we could say more effective legislation, and communication and engagement strategies to enable resilient homes for all parts of society. So how we, well, first of all, before we get into the details of how we're trying to achieve that, what is the scope? We're trying to be quite broad in our scope in terms of housing. So we're saying we want to look at both existing housing, new housing, and in New Zealand, we don't have a lot of medium density housing, but there's a big drive for that as we have a housing shortage. So also thinking about new medium density housing solutions, and we want to try and look at how we improve the performance in all those areas. How do we ensure we've got a thriving residential community considering all those types of houses we have? So at this point, well, we're also wary when we're talking about this research that we shouldn't just have our earthquake engineering, or let's say our seismic lens on performance. We need to be thinking about a range of performance metrics. There are social, environmental, and you think about thermal performance. When I say environmental, think about sustainability, and then construction speed and cost, fire performance. So that's also a challenge in terms of developing any new strategies, making sure we don't just look at it from an earthquake point of view. Julia.
Cool. So as Tim was saying, sort of in the development of our scope, what we did was we held a workshop, which was, wow, it was nearly over a year ago. No, almost a year to the day. But yeah, so just really kind of nut out and see whether what we were intending to focus on was what people were kind of wanting, and to really kind of nut out some of the challenges around different aspects of housing. And so we invited a range of different people, stakeholders to the group, ranging from engineers through to people involved in housing issues such as housing availability, those types of issues, to really have a discussion around some key focus areas. And so you can see those focus areas up there on the diagram, hopefully. So they included things like insurance and legal challenges, which Tim's already mentioned, engineering challenges, more broader human challenges, and I guess those are socioeconomic and challenges around how do you design for different ethnic needs, and planning and infrastructure challenges as well. So we had some quite good discussions, and I think overall we found that from the discussions when we looked through our notes that the discussions we had confirmed the direction that we were wanting to head in was the one that was a good one. We had discussions around the focus on resilience on low-rise, sort of medium-density built new buildings, but obviously not forgetting the current housing retrofits that might be needed, because a lot of our building stock, 80% maybe, was the kind of the number bandied around. 80% of our houses are already existing, so kind of having a balance on both. There were discussions about different approaches to what makes up a thriving residential community, and where a sort of a Pākehā approach might be different from a Māori approach, and kind of understanding what a thriving community is and how you get there. We had, there were appreciation of all sorts of different challenges in this space. So from things like cost, accessibility of housing, through people just having other priorities. So really just trying to identify some of those challenges that we might have around those issues. And then we talked quite a bit about the linkage between thriving residential communities and having infrastructure that is sound and can kind of meet the needs of that community as well. So looking at, I guess, at some of the broader linkages. So that's probably a good summary of that workshop. So thank you, Tim. You can move on to the next one. And so that really leads us into, I guess, our research focus areas, which have been sort of developed and then built on by this workshop. And we have quite a range of different, I guess, types of research to reach those objectives, from the engineering through to the more social aspects. So the first two we have up here are really trying to understand legal frameworks and planning for thriving residential communities. So one aspect of this is really looking at, how do our legal frameworks contribute to creating earthquake resilient communities, and how we adapt those so that we have good outcomes. And then looking at some ideas around tools. So what legal mechanisms can we use to improve perhaps choices of resilient new housing solutions, or maybe voluntary retrofitting, and what are some of the legal issues that arise. And Natalie's also looking at kind of human rights perspectives as well around these kind of issues as well. So that's kind of in the scope of, I guess, the broader thriving residential community. And then moving into earthquake insurance, obviously during the Canterbury Earthquakes, there's been issues around the earthquake insurance and how that was applied, and lots of insurance hasn't been resolved still. So really looking at some of the models that could be used to incentivize adoption of more resilient housing solutions, including things like insurance policy wordings, how that might fit. Tim, sorry, did you want to say something there? No.
I was just going to mention that these are topics for the first sort of half of our 7-year project, and that in the planning space, we recognise there's quite an opportunity to improve our or explore ways that planning processes could be improved and how that could impact significantly on resilience. But we actually have trouble trying to get researchers in the planning space involved. Wendy Saunders there's, of course, now changed jobs. So anyway, back over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, no, that's an important point, and I might speak to a couple of those maybe challenges that are coming up a little bit later on as well, and maybe people can think about how they might want to be involved, or they might know people who might want to be involved in that. So if you flick onto the next slide there, Tim. So some of the other research focus areas include understanding and reducing the vulnerability of existing housing stock. So that's sort of twofold. It's really about quantifying the vulnerability of housing stock so that you can kind of understand what the issues are and what improvements and changes can be made. And there is a specific project looking at hillside housing as well. But it also kind of feeds in with trying to understand kind of what the vulnerabilities might mean from a social aspect as well. And that also links with the seismic performance expectations research focus area below, where we're really trying to explore some of the expectations of housing performance and people's understanding of likely performance in an earthquake. And then some of those gaps and some of those, how do we work with these kind of expectations and perceptions, and in order to kind of get people to either retrofit their houses or maybe want to purchase more resilient housing. And there's some definite links here in this particular project with IP1, which is the functional recovery project, and some of the resilient buildings project that's going on at the moment as well, that was talked about at the New Zealand Society for Earthquake Engineering conference. So you can, I'll pass over to Tim again now, I think.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Julia. So yeah, just following on from that, I thought I'd mention that Kakati Royal's name's there too. He's working with myself and Tumanako at University of Auckland, looking at seismic performance expectations and how engineering design criteria could be set up to achieve those from a Maori perspective. And he's talking with different iwi around, and the plan is to do more of that talking. We sort of got interrupted with COVID, but around that. So there's some interesting work going on that front too. In terms of a resilient, another area is resilient medium density housing solutions. I mentioned this at the start of the talk, or fairly early on, and the idea is to be looking at a range of different options for medium density housing, and the researchers there, we've got a range of people with experience in reinforced concrete, like precast concrete. Alessandra's interested in modular housing systems. Ming Hao is, and David and Angela from Brands, they're quite active timber housing, but David's also, and Angela are also interested in other types of medium density. And then Puya Lofty-Rad and Charles Clifton and James Lim, they're quite interested in the and doing work in the area of light gauge steel framed housing systems rather than using timber framed housing. And those systems can go up to quite a few stories. So the idea is that they develop these seismically resistant systems with, again, that focus on multiple performance criteria. And for example, for the light gauge steel frame housing systems, one of the challenges I understand they're dealing with is how to deal with fire. And then consider issues related to non-structural elements for medium density housing. We've had, Rajesh has been leading quite a lot of work with myself in the area of non-structural elements, and we of course need to be considering that. It's interesting, I've seen some data suggesting around 30% of losses in houses were related to contents. Of course that depends on the events, the shaking, but of course it's not just about the structure, but also what we've got in the house and how do we protect that. And then there are foundation systems, and Gabriele Chiaro is looking at testing and developing this innovative sort of foundation system which uses rubber, and they're doing some testing this year. I think the scale of that testing has been reduced a bit owing to restrictions to do with COVID, but there's more numerical work, and we're going to have a talk from him in the coming months. He's indicated he's keen on that. And Maxim Millen there, he's been looking at soil structure interaction, as well as helping supervise a student who's looking at the performance of some of our systems for TC2 and TC3 land. So what does that mean? Some of the ground around Christchurch and other parts of the country, which is deemed liquefiable, has a certain liquefaction potential. You can still build on it if you use a certain type of foundation system. And what we're aiming to do in this research is to test the performance of those proposed systems. They're out there being used, but we're keen to sort of understand better what their likely performance is going to be. We also have an area on resilient infrastructure, so especially, I guess the key word there is infrastructure. And Liam, I think he's on the call, and Richard Moles has been involved with that. We're really borrowing, we say, in collaboration with some of the work that is going on in the Resilience to Nature's challenge there. And we're keen in the longer term to be doing more in the infrastructure space. We've been talking with people from the Canterbury Earthquakes. A lot of housing, a lot of people had to live with really sort of substandard, let's say, infrastructure, like levels of service, people living with portaloos for a year or more after the earthquakes, even though the rest of their house was perhaps not damaged. So how do we improve performance on an infrastructure level? And Julia's going to talk more about what a little bit about the infrastructure work that's been going on in a later slide. We're also looking at low damage housing solutions. At QuakeCoRE 1, we developed a base isolated system for housing, and we've been working with with people, different groups in the community. There's a few people, homeowners, interested to build with the system. We haven't yet got one built, but it's looking like we're getting close. But of course, the cost is the driving factor in trying to get confidence and security in that cost is going to be interesting. So we're trying to get through that. And we're also looking at other low damage housing solutions. And again, those light gauge steel framed houses could be considered perhaps low damage, and there are other options to look at low damage systems there. We're not just looking at the engineering, we're also wanting to look at the factors that either encourage or discourage the uptake of these more resilient housing solutions, and sort of think of ways of dealing with those. So that's an overview of the different areas we're working in. I just thought I'd provide a little bit of an example of progress. I might go through this fairly quickly, just in the interest of time, but I just thought I'd focus on this one area, which is understanding and reducing the vulnerability of existing housing stock, and mention that we have been doing some testing following on from the shake table testing of a base isolated sort of housing system. We're taking, essentially what we do is we look at a room of a house. Our shake table is not that big, so we've taken out a room with the same dynamic characteristics as the whole house, what we expect for the whole house, and we've got a window and jib lined walls and timber framing and a ceiling and weights on the roof to simulate the weight of the whole house, and we shake that on a table. Here's some details of the framing system. We got a builder to come in and build this as he would have done a normal house. So sort of standard details there, shouldn't be any surprises. And then we ran various ground motions of different intensities, and we increased the intensity, and we're looking for signs of damage at increased intensities and trying to track how that damage occurs. What we were able to see is in some ways expected, that overall there was nothing fell down, quite a bit of cracking in the plasterboard, and the intensity at which that started was quite low, which is again aligns with what we saw in the earthquakes, at less than, let's say, serviceability level type design loads. The hold downs performed well. There was a sort of a tear here that you wouldn't notice unless you removed the jib, so we could see from behind the wall the jib panel, and the glue between the stud and the jib had sort of caused a tear. You wouldn't see that unless you open up the wall. But that's initially the cracks were just quite small, and then they just grew and grew as the intensity got higher. At some point, one of the panels just completely failed, and so on. So we got some useful information from that, also about how this system behaves in terms of how much is it deform, what's the accelerations we're getting, and then we're able to compare that with our numerical model. So what we do using this results for particularly is to gain confidence in our modeling approaches. So now we have these computer models where we introduce, based on the behavior of the screws through the panels and into the wood, we can use that as part of a detailed model where we go and insert all the numbers of screws we've got at all the spacing and considering the studs. We model the diaphragms, and then we can introduce the ground motion that we ran through the table and compare our predictions with responses. And you can see 3 different earthquake simulations here with the same model, and the differences between our predictions and the observations, the models in red, the recordings in black. So we're getting what are pretty good predictions. You wouldn't say they're perfect, but from a shake table real building sort of point of view, they're giving us confidence. So how will these models be useful? We can develop these to assess the vulnerability, or let's say performance of housing, realized with different design criteria. So if we were ever going to change something in our design criteria, what would the impact be in terms of both upfront construction costs and also long-term performance. And we can then seek design criteria that are the most effective in reducing losses. To this extent, I thought I'd pull out this figure that was again presented by Tom and Taylor in IP2. And it's an interesting figure because it shows how our modern houses, that's the post-1992, if you look at the high intensity range, they are performing better than our older buildings, and the damage and losses are lower. So we can see already how our code provisions can really help improve performance. But what is also a bit worrying is how even at these modern buildings at low intensities, and these are events that occur quite often, you know, this could be an earthquake that's not very intense, not very big magnitude, for example, we can still get quite a bit of damage. Now you say, well, 5% damage, that's not much, but if it's happening to most houses in an area, then that starts to become quite significant. We're also, and I mentioned that before, testing these current provisions for new foundations. So over to you, Julia.
Well, thanks, Tim. I'm just going to give a couple of updates from a few different projects, but very briefly, and you can contact the researchers in question if you want to find out a bit more about them. Now, I see Catalina's on the call. Catalina, I'm just going to talk about your research for a little bit. So if anyone wants to talk to Catalina further about this, yeah, just give her a bell, drop her an email. So this is Catalina's project on homeowners' damage expectations before and after retrofitting, and she did a survey a couple of years back of owners of wooden framed houses in Wellington to try and understand what their expectations of the performance of their houses were, and what they had done to structurally improve their houses, and what some of the drivers for that were. And just some interesting findings here. I've pulled these together from two of the papers. So one of them is already out, and you can get hold of that, and one of them's back in review, hopefully in press. Let's cross our fingers on that one. So yeah, so some of the main findings from this project include obviously the most recent large earthquake to impact Wellington was the QuakeCoRE earthquake. But in looking at that particular earthquake, she found no particular relationship between earthquake experience and adoption of strengthening. It's often what we call a normalization bias, where people may have experienced impacts that perhaps weren't very big or might have been slightly benign. And so that experience doesn't necessarily prompt you to do anything more. So experiences of quite moderate or benign earthquakes might not prompt things like strengthening. And similar to other findings that are coming out of some of the research, such as the Resilient Buildings project, in a future earthquake, people expected better performance from their houses than sort of the life safety aspect of the code. So people are expecting to be able to have houses that are functional after an event, and that don't have too much damage. Excuse my cat. We found that similar to other literature, so a lot of work's been done in survival preparedness, so getting together food and water. But we know that if people see the benefit of doing some of those actions, then they're more likely to prepare for a future event. And the same was really found in terms of structural preparedness, which hadn't really been studied before. So if you see the benefits of making structural changes to your house, you think your house is going to recover better or fare better after an earthquake, then you're more likely to do that. So that has implications for what you give in terms of information on how you promote that kind of strengthening, and what you say to people about what the benefits of that are. So yeah, so people are more likely to undertake mitigation if they understand what they need to do, some specific instructions, and what the outcome will be. So they'll get a benefit. They'll be resilient to a future earthquake. There's also some interesting findings from her work around information. So people who were more prepared generally acquired some of their information from builders, whereas those that were unprepared had sought information from Wellington City Council or EQC. So again, implications for the type of information you're giving out. They're going to be different people at different phases of the information seeking and preparedness phase process. And so you need multiple sources of information. But the fact that builders do have an influence on this process could really be studied a bit further about kind of how they can help better to achieve good outcomes, what kind of training they might need. So that's definitely something that could be a future focus. In terms of the emergency levels of service project by Richard Mole, many of you may have seen this presentation at the QuakeCoRE conference in last year. Richard did a short presentation, a lightning presentation on it. So his work is progressing well. He has a framework that looks at different types of emergency levels of service for the Wellington region. So for example, how many days are you going to have to wait before you get water? What level of service is desired? What do you need? How do you plan for that? And you can do that across all sorts of different infrastructure providers. So he's at the point where he's been able to refine his table, and there's an example of his table in this particular paper here, which you can go to. It's open access, or you can contact me for it. And he just ran a workshop yesterday, just trying to verify some of the outcomes of this particular research. So his framework is in the process of being verified by different stakeholders. This is a great project, and it will probably eventually lead to some kind of legislative change around trying to make sure that people are planning for emergency levels of service. Thank you. And the last one here is really around land use planning for earthquakes. So building on some previous work where we identified that over 20 years there had been any significant improvement in land use planning for earthquakes. This paper, which is about to come out in June, really kind of considers that issue and then looks, I guess, forward at where we're going from here. So we've had the RMA for quite a long time, Resource Management Act. Now we're moving into a phase where we're going to have a new Natural Built Environments Act. So I looked across the bill to see what was in it, and there are some things that could potentially improve our land use planning for earthquakes. So there's the impetus for greater national direction and more risk in that particular document. And there is a reduction in plans, land use plans. So I think it's down to 14 as opposed to the many that they have at the moment, which could help with regional consistency in some of this planning. But I think one of the key issues is really identified as implementation is still going to be an issue. Internationally, within New Zealand, implementing some of these legislative documents and some of these plans still a problem. So we really need to do some thinking around how we improve that. And just onto the last slide there, just a reminder to everyone, if you haven't seen it already, that we do have a Thriving Residential Community Scholarship, PhD scholarship advertised at the moment. So if you know of someone who might want to apply, the closing date is very soon. It's on Sunday, so get going and ask them to apply. It's really focused on using some of the GeoNet data that we collect on things that happen in earthquakes, to damage to buildings, and to non-structural parts of buildings, and really trying to use that data a bit better to understand what some of the impacts are from previous earthquakes based on the citizen science data we've collected. And it can be engineering focused, or it can be more social science focused. So get them to contact me. So yeah, the last slide here is if you'd like to get involved in the wider Thriving Residential Communities program, we're definitely keen to broaden the group. I know I've definitely had some interest more in the social aspects of kind of understanding housing, what that means for people. But Tim will have also other ideas as well. So come to our monthly meetings, and also happy for you to directly make contact and have a chat with us as well. Be involved in future bids, those types of things. Back to you, Tim.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening, joining to this